Embarking on a journey, whether to a bustling city or serene wilderness, presents countless opportunities for capturing memorable moments. As a photo enthusiast, selecting the right camera gear could be a daunting task. Hi, I'm Belinda. As I mentioned in my recent videos, we traveled for 5.5 months last year. Out of those 5.5 months, I spent 4 months traveling with my 2 kids in Europe alone. I packed most of my camera gear in the beginning of the trip, but soon I realized it was just not realistic to lug around everything everywhere. So today I'd like to share with you the camera gear I actually used during our long trip, and hopefully it will give you a sense of what might be the right camera gear for you in the future. Make sure to watch till the end of the video where I'll share more resources to help you learn how to take better travel photos for your family and friends. First and foremost, here are some statistics. I've taken a total of nearly 55,000 photos for the entire trip. Out of the total, I've taken almost 50,000 or 91% of the photos with my Canon EOS R5. The rest, 5,117 photos or 9% were taken from my Sony a7 IV. I have no camera bias. I love both my Canon EOS R5 and Sony a7 IV, and both are full-frame mirrorless cameras capable of capturing a full spectrum of photo subjects during any trips. The big difference and the ultimate choice of the camera rests in the lenses. I brought 3 lenses for my Canon R5, and all of them are zoom lenses, which are my preferred lenses to photograph my children. I brought 2 lenses for my Sony a7 IV. Both of them are prime lenses. Since my photo style is a mixture of documentary, candid, and action, I almost never stop my family or children to pose for me during any trips. This requires fast camera adjustment. Between zoom and prime lenses, it's no-brainer. It's much faster and convenient to change composition on a zoom lens. If you want to have a crop view, you just need to rotate the lens and zoom in. If you want to have a wider view, you just rotate on the lens and zoom out. But if you use a prime lens, you have to move yourself forwards and backwards in order to change the composition. If you take candid or street photography, and lots of the photo opportunities only last for a split of a second, if you use a prime lens, by the time you move to the right spot, your photo opportunity could be gone. If you like to photograph your kids, or if your kids happen to have infinite amount of energy that cannot be stopped like mine, or if you would like to document your travel in candid style, it's much easier and convenient to use a zoom lens. Sometimes in crowded scenes or tighter spaces, you probably don't even have the option to move forward or backward. So in my own experience, zoom lenses are much more versatile during travels. However, prime lenses or fixed zoom lenses have their advantage as well. They typically have larger aperture, which means they perform better in low light conditions. And oftentimes, prime lenses have smaller weight and size, easier to carry around, and less intimidating for strangers if you do street photography. My most used lens on this trip was the Canon 24-70mm f2.8. I've taken nearly 30,000 photos with this lens. That's 54% of all the photos for this entire trip. While 24-70mm f2.8 isn't the best lens in any photo category, it is the most versatile lens, especially for travelers. You can photograph portrait, landscape, indoors, outdoors. Except the wild animals in Africa safari, you can possibly use this lens for any photo scenarios. So here are some of my examples. You can possibly see the kids outdoors, kids indoors, landscape photography, architecture, cityscape, seascape, night photography. Well, all of these were shot with the 24-70 f2.8. If I had to choose only one camera and one lens for any trips, this 24-70mm f2.8 is definitely my top choice. My second used lens on this trip was the Canon RF70-200mm f2.8. I took nearly 15,000 photos, or 27% of all the photos with this lens. If you're new to mirrorless or DSLR photography and wanted to have some instant gratification from a lens, this lens might be your top choice. The 70-200mm f2.8 lenses have been my long-term favorite outdoor portrait lenses. And in fact, many of my favorite personal photos from this trip was from this lens, although it was not used very often. The reason was very simple. When we traveled in crowded urban scenes, using a long lens to photograph in a big crowd was always challenging. You have to keep a pretty good distance from your subject when you use a long lens. But when you're surrounded by a crowd, it's very easy for someone to walk into your frame. Also, because I was traveling with my kids alone for so long, it was just impractical to keep a long distance from them in the street. Another shortcoming of the 70-200mm lens is it can be mostly used in open and outdoor spaces. But even in outdoor scenarios, for example on a crowded beach, it could be a little bit awkward using such a large lens. We celebrated my 6-year-old's birthday in the south coast of Portugal. I took a ton of photos of him on the beach when he was having a blast playing with water. But I noticed that when I kept a distance to photograph him, even I was pointing my camera to him, but the fact the beach was so crowded, I was pointing to him through the crowd probably makes some people uncomfortable. Here's my Canon RF15-35mm f2.8. It's my favorite wide-angle lens. I've taken a total of 5,227 photos, or 10% of all the photos with this lens for this trip. I mostly used this lens for landscape photography. When I was traveling with my 2 kids alone for the first 4 months, I knew that I wouldn't have that much opportunities to take landscape photos, so I didn't even bring this lens at all. All of these photos were taken in the last 1.5 months of this trip when my husband joined us and brought this lens back to me. We did extensive road trips throughout Romania, Morocco, and Ireland, and I finally had a good chance to photograph landscape. That's when this lens finally shined. If you are someone into landscape photography, this will be one of your best lens choices. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't mean that you can only use the 70-200mm lens for portrait and the 15-35mm lens for landscape. You can totally take gorgeous landscape photos with a long lens and some interesting people shots with a wide-angle lens. But these are not what these lenses are best suited for, especially if you're a beginner. It definitely takes some practice how to use these lenses for a wide range of subjects. Please like or subscribe if you find this video useful, or forward it to whoever who might need it. Now, let's take a look at the Sony a7 IV. I brought 2 lenses, the Sony 24mm f1.4 and the Sony 35mm 1.4, along with this camera. But since 2 of my Canon zoom lenses covered both 24 and 35mm focal length, my Sony prime lenses were almost redundant. Nevertheless, due to the wide aperture and the 2 stops advantage over my Canon zoom lenses, my Sony prime lenses definitely have a significant advantage in low light conditions, such as restaurants, aquariums, or museums, or even night photography. When we knew that I had to spend some time traveling with my kids alone, I knew that I had to downsize. It was just impractical to bring 2 camera bodies and 5 lenses all the time. So we actually shipped some of our belongings back to the US, including my Sony 35mm 1.4 lens, my DJI drone, as well as one of my tripods and some filters. Letting go of the drone was a no-brainer because we spent a lot of time in the urban scenes and it was impossible to fly over the crowd. You probably couldn't even do that, right? In terms of tripods and filters, as I mentioned before, mostly were used for landscape photography, and when I traveled with the kids alone, so I had to let go landscape photography opportunities, and it was just not practical. Although I have shared a blog post about how to photograph landscape while traveling with young children, I will leave you the link below. The rest of the 2 camera bodies and the 3 lenses can all fit into 1 camera backpack, my f-stop camera backpack, which I purchased over 10 years ago. So this was a lot more manageable. Although I took 0 photos with the Sony 35mm 1.4 lens in this trip, It is a great lens, and it's actually a very versatile lens. If you are someone who prefer to have one camera, one lens solution, particularly if you photograph indoor and low light scenarios very often, I would highly suggest you to consider a 35mm prime. The last lens I used on this trip was the Sony 24mm f1.4. I've taken a total of 5,117 photos, or 9% of all the photos with this lens on this trip. The Sony 24mm 1.4 lens was great for low light indoor scenarios as well as for astrophotography. In the past, when I photographed northern lights or Milky Way, the 24mm prime lens was a great choice due to its wide aperture. I could use much shorter shutter speed to photograph my night subjects. Considering the environment to photograph astrophotography subjects, it was typically very cold, sometimes very windy. Shorter shutter speed means earlier time to wrap up, less time to suffer in the extreme weather. In fact, my then 8-year-old was carrying my Sony a7 IV paired with this 24mm prime lens most of the time during the second half of our trip. His interest was to photograph animals such as stray cats or birds. Quick reminder, if you wanted to use a wide-angle lens to photograph people, pets, small animals, you definitely need to get really close to your subject. Otherwise, your subjects will appear as a small dot in your frame. Another disadvantage of wide-angle lens is the distortion on the side and in the corners of your photo frame. Try to put your people or animal subject in the middle of your frame to avoid this distortion. I'd say a wide-angle lens, such as this 24mm prime lens, is definitely not very user-friendly for beginner photographers. But once you get a hang of it, it could be a very versatile lens for you during your travel. Beyond the camera and lenses, my most used accessories was two NiSi 1 to 5 stop variable ND filters. They're exactly the same other than the thread size. One of them has the 82mm diameter that can be fit for both my Canon 24-70mm f2.8 zoom lens and the 15 to 35mm f2.8 zoom lens. Both of these two Canon zoom lenses have the 82mm diameter. And the other NiSi filter has the 67mm diameter and can fit both my Sony prime lenses. I almost never took off my NiSi filters. They're always mounted on one of my lenses when I use the camera because I like to photograph my kids in wide aperture, and using ND filters allows me to do that even in the strongest sunlight last summer. One more filter I also used on this trip was my Lee Big Stopper, which I purchased over 10 years ago for landscape photography. I didn't use this filter until the last 1.5 months of this trip when my husband joined us. He brought along the tripod, my Canon wide-angle zoom lens, as well as this filter. Different from the NiSi variable filters, which were always mounted on my lens and camera, I only use a Big Stopper or 10-stop filters for specific landscape photography, water scenes, for example, particularly ocean waves or sometimes waterfalls. When you use a 10-stop filter, you can slow down your shutter speed to 1 minute, 2 minutes, or even longer, smoothing out your water surface and giving you a tranquil, serene scene. A tripod was a must for any of my trips. I typically use 2 tripods to take landscape photos because I wanted to create different compositions with 2 different cameras at the same time. But for this trip, especially for the first 4 months when I had to travel with my 2 kids alone, I didn't even bring the tripod. However, when we were in the beautiful scenes in Marseille of South France, Venice in Italy, Himara of Albania, Dubrovnik of Croatia, Algarve in South Portugal, I felt compelled I had to take some landscape photos without a tripod because the sceneries were just so gorgeous. But without a tripod, I had to come up with some creative solutions. For example, setting my camera on a bench, on the ground, on whatever steady surface I could find. The composition was definitely less than ideal, but being able to bring back some photos was better than getting none. And most importantly, I tried something new and brought back some amazing memories that would otherwise be lost. So in summary, for the first 4 months, I have used 2 cameras, 3 lenses, and 2 filters. For the last 1.5 months of our trip, when my husband joined us, I have used 2 camera bodies, 4 lenses, 3 filters, and a tripod. Now, don't get me wrong, getting more camera equipment doesn't mean that you will get better travel pictures. In fact, you want to spend the time to get really familiar with your equipment so you know what your equipment is best suited for. During my travel days with my kids, I typically only bring 1 camera and 1 lens for a particular day, so I didn't have to fumble and change lenses all the time. Typically, I made travel itinerary the night before and had a general idea what we're gonna see and photograph the second day. So for the second day, I'll pick the camera and lens that are best suited for the photo subjects. But if you're just starting out and don't know what kind of photo you wanted to take and what is your photo style, you can always choose a versatile lens to start with. For example, the 24-70mm f2.8, as I suggested before. I know it's not the cheapest option, but it's better than getting the wrong camera gear and not using it. If you travel in the summer or want to create both photos and videos, consider getting some quality ND filters. After using dozens of filters over the past 10 years, NiSi filters are so far my favorite. By the way, nobody is sponsoring this video. I'm just talking about my personal experience. If you're interested in knowing more details of certain camera equipment or filters, please leave me a comment below. Maybe I'll provide more details in future videos. In case if you're interested in knowing what digital camera is right for you, please check out my 1-hour free video guide, the Mirrorless Camera Ultimate Buying Guide. Hopefully it will save you hours, days, or even weeks research time to find out the right camera gear for yourself. In addition to my camera equipment, here are all the electronics that I use almost on a daily basis. The 14-inch MacBook Pro, 3 external SSDs ranging between 2 to 4 terabytes, 1 portable hard drive with 5 terabyte storage as a backup, a whole bunch of cables, 2 to 3 different card readers, global travel adapters, as well as smartphones. Last but not least, I just wanted to tell you that you can create beautiful photos from any camera equipment. Don't think that other photographers get better photos just because they have better camera gear or they use Photoshop. It's oftentimes not true. I can tell you that you have plenty of chances to take crappy photos from a sophisticated camera. It's all about practice. No matter what camera equipment you have, make the best use of it. Get familiar with it. Practice. Take advantage of its best features and create the best photos from it. If you want to take better travel photos for your family and kids, you can check out my free video training. I'll leave you the link in the description below. And if you haven't yet, make sure to check this video where I've shared more practical and easy to follow tips to improve your photography without upgrading your camera gear.